Once upon a time, there were two little princesses whose names were Violetta and Gambetta, and they lived in Mountainy Castle. They were twins, and they were so like each other that when Violetta came in from a walk with her feet wet, Gambetta was sometimes told to go and change her stockings, because the queen couldn't tell which from the other. But that didn't often happen, because if Princess Violetta was out for a walk, Princess Gambetta was almost sure to be out with her. Indeed, they were so fond of one another that you might have thought they were tied together with a piece of string. All the same, the queen used to be so fussed and worried by the confusion that, what with one thing and another, she persuaded the king to appoint a special lord to distinguish between them, and he was called the Lord High Teller of the Other from Which. The first thing he did, after he was given this office, was to decree that everyone should call them by shorter names because, as he said, their names both ended with "etta," and that made it much harder to tell.
"Why does it make it harder to tell?" said the king. "I don't see why it should make it harder."
"Never mind why, your majesty," the Lord High Teller replied firmly, "but it does."
"Very well," said his majesty. "I think you are rather a fool, but I will do as you say, and I will see that my subjects do as you say, because this is your job and not mine."
And he went off hunting. So after that, one of the sisters was called Princess Violet, and the other was called Princess Gamboy. Now, as it happened, the Lord High Teller of the Other from Which was not a fool at all, but a very wise man. He had noticed something about the two little princesses which nobody had noticed. Moreover, he knew a great deal about the magic power of names. For, soon after he had given them these new names, everybody else began to notice the same thing too. And before very long, it was the rarest thing in the world for anybody about the court to mistake one for the other. But first, you must know how it came about that these two princesses were so much alike, even after they were quite tall girls. Well, the king and queen had had a party at their christening, and among all the grand people they had asked Mrs. Thompson to step in. Now, Miss Thompson was a relation by marriage of the Queen's, and she was a nobody, and she wasn't of the blood royal, or else she wouldn't have been called Miss Thompson. She lived in a little cottage in Titterhangen Lane. But the Queen had heard tell that this Miss Thompson was growing a witchery sort of woman in her old age, and that she knew this and that. So she said to the king, "If we don't ask her, she may turn sour, and come in at the window of her own accord on a broomstick, and do this and that. But if we ask her to come she will, because of the christening breakfast, and she may bring the babies a present worth all the golden rattles and silver teaspoons, and mahogany rocking horses with real hair and eyes that move up and down in the world." So they sent her an invitation, and she came. She was dressed in black, and, when she walked, she leaned on a black stick with a silver handle. And of course her hat was narrower at the top than it was at the bottom. Her eyes were black too, and didn't they sparkle? Now when she had finished her bacon and toast and marmalade, she went up to the cradles, where all the grand people were standing about talking, and leaned over them. And the king and queen, who had been watching her all the time from the other end of the room, held their breaths very hard and said, "Now it's coming, now it's coming," to themselves as she leaned over the cradles. Then the corners of Miss Thompson's mouth began to go into little creases, and she looked so whimsical, and said very solemnly, waving her stick and looking at the king and queen out of the corner of her eye, "Fumble, fumble, all around tumble, baby princesses always be as like as one to another pea. This gifty I give for as long as ye live. Fumble, fumble, all around tumble." Then she went up to the king and queen and said politely, "I'm afraid I must be going now, your majesties. Thank you so much." The queen said, "Well, not at all," and she added, "Thank you very much for your kind present to my daughters." "It was magic," said Miss Thompson. "I know," said the queen, who had really been bitterly disappointed that Miss Thompson hadn't given her baby something nicer. "It was magic you wanted," said Miss Thompson sharply. "Yes," said the queen humbly, Now this Miss Thompson was really a kind-hearted old lady, and she couldn't bear to see the Queen look so disappointed, especially after such a lovely breakfast. So she said, "Wait a minute," and went back to the cradles again. And this time there were no creases round her mouth, and she didn't wave her stick, but she frowned and looked hard into the little princess's eyes and said quietly, "As long as you both live, you shall love each other more than all else in the world. As long as one of you is living, both shall be." Then she went back to the king and queen and said in a business-like voice, "Now I really must be going." But the queen, who had heard what she said over the cradles, fell suddenly on her knees and wept tears of joy, thanking dear Miss Thompson over and over again, kissing her hands and saying, "I don't deserve it. I don't deserve it. I only asked you here because I hoped you would give my daughters a present. I don't deserve it. Oh, now I know that my daughters will make each other happy." "Don't be too sure about that," said Miss Thompson, and bowed out of the room backwards, like the little lady she was. That was how it came about that the two princesses were so like each other, and that was how it came about that they were so fond of each other. Of course, it would have been quite easy to tell them apart by making them dress in different clothes, but unfortunately there was a law in that country that all princesses were to wear the same clothes until they reached the age of 21, when they might choose for themselves. Indoors, they had to wear little sky-blue tunics with silver-gray stockings, and out of doors, a little black cloak over it all. As for their hair, a princess in that country was banished at once if she was found with her hair plaited or tied up with a bow or anything of that sort. Whereas she shall have her hair to hang loosely down her back and well combed. That was what the law said, meaning well combed. It was only in the royal nursery, or in the west corner of the Queen's garden, that Violetta and Gambetta were allowed to wear just what they liked, and to do their hair just as they pleased. What was it that the Lord High-Teller of the Other from Which had noticed about the two princesses before he had their names altered? One day he was walking in the garden to take the air, when he saw the two sisters playing together near the entrance gate. Just then a little ragged boy passed along the road outside, crying and crying. Violetta's eyes filled with tears, and she ran out and gave him an apple she had in her hand and asked him what was the matter. The Lord High-Teller couldn't hear what she said or what the little boy said, but he saw the little boy gradually stop crying as he listened, and go off at last with his face all shining. Then the Princess Violetta came back to her sister, and the Lord High-Teller heard them talking to each other. "What are you crying about?" said Gambetta. "Oh, I can't help it," said Violetta. "I am thinking of all the other little ragged boys. Oh dear, I am so miserable." And she went on crying. "Don't be silly," said Gambetta. "I expect he started crying like that on purpose to make you give him your apple." "Why should you think so?" said Violetta. "People are like that," said Gambetta. "I don't believe it," said Violetta through her tears. "You'll learn in time, my dear," said Gambetta, who was 1 minute older than her sister. The noble lord didn't hear any more of their conversation, but he smiled rather sadly to himself as he walked on. And a week later, when the king appointed him Lord High-Teller of the Other from Which, he knew quite well, of course, that the princesses ought to be called Violet and Gamboy. And they were. From that time on, the king and queen and the whole court gradually began to see what the Lord High-Teller had seen already. It was this. The two little princesses, who were so much alike on the outside that you couldn't tell them apart, were as different inside as a church from a booking office. But the two spells which Miss Thompson had laid on them at their christening remained unbroken. When Princess Gamboy had said so many sour things that an ugly wrinkle began to show in her face, the same wrinkle began to show in Princess Violet's face, whether she liked it or not. But on the other hand, when Princess Violet had danced and sung so much, for she was very fond of singing and dancing, and made so many people happy that two quite new dimples appeared on both sides of her mouth, the same dimples appeared on both sides of Princess Gamboy's mouth, whether she liked it or not. Of course the dimples and wrinkles got in each other's way a good deal, and the dimples were not quite so pretty, and the wrinkles not quite so ugly as they might have been. In short, while Princess Gamboy was not nearly so ugly as she would otherwise have been, neither was Princess Violet quite so beautiful. That was what the spell did. As for the other spell, the only thing in the whole world which Princess Gamboy loved was Princess Violet, and, among the hundreds of thousands of things which Princess Violet loved, Princess Gamboy, no matter what she might say or do, was far and away the first. They could not bear to be out of each other's company for an hour, although, when they were together, they did nothing but argue, and have conversations like the one which the Lord High Teller overheard. So the two princesses grew up side by side in the castle until one morning, when Princess Violet was dancing, as a leaf dances in the wind, in the west corner of the Queen's garden, and Princess Gamboy was reading in a big black book called Excerpta, and continually looking up and saying to Violet, "Keep still, can't you?" They heard a silver trumpet sounding faintly in the distance. Princess Violet knew it must be a silver one, because the noise it made was like a bell. But Princess Gamboy said rudely, "Nonsense! I don't believe you can tell what it's made of. And if it is, it's ridiculous to waste so much of the public money on a trumpet. Silver, indeed! Tut!" And she bent her head down over her book again, frowning and mumbling something which sounded to Violet like "Form forze eit tutsten." Poor Violet felt crushed, but she didn't say anything, and ran straight off to the gate to see who it was, for she felt quite sure the trumpet had been blown by someone on his way to the castle. She pressed her forehead against the bars of the gate and made 2 white marks on it, but there was nothing to be seen yet in the dusty white road leading up over the hills. Then suddenly she heard the trumpet again, and this time it sounded a little nearer. "Rooty tooty 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 doo, doo tooty 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 doo, rooty doo rooty doo rooty doo." "It is like a bell," she said to herself, "and I know it's made of silver." And she began to feel so happy, because it seemed as though there must be a piece of silver somewhere inside her, which was still vibrating on and on to the trumpet, till she fell in a dream in which she was listening to church bells across the water on a summer evening. But then, right on top of the hill, where the road vanished into the sky, she saw a little cloud of dust. The cloud grew bigger, and she knew it was made by advancing horsemen. Then the trumpet call again, ringing out clear and loud and joyous this time, as the sweet waves of sound welled from its mouth and spread out through the air until they lapped smoothly on her ear, unbroken by any wind. "Rooty tooty 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 too, too tooty 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 too, rooty too rooty too rooty too." At last the dust began to clear a little, and Princess Violet could distinguish the figure of a tall young man on a white horse at the head of the party. He was clad in glittering silver armor, not that kind which is made in separate stiff pieces and makes a man look like 5 tin sausages, but the kind which is called chain mail. It is all woven in shining links, so that it looks like a million watch chains and fits as close as wool. Violet rushed back to where Gamboy was sitting. "It's a prince!" she shrieked, and she waltzed round Gamboy, singing over and over again a little song which meant absolutely nothing at all. It sounded like, "Create a sensation of glory, all in the land of Judea." She always sang it when she felt excited. You see, they hardly ever had a visitor at Mountainy Castle, and Violet, happy as she was, sometimes felt dull and cross and tired of singing and dancing all by herself. But all Princess Gamboy said was, "Well, don't get so excited about him. It will only make him more conceited than he is already." "How do you know he is conceited already?" said Princess Violet. "Oh, I don't know," answered Gamboy, "but they nearly always are." "But you've never met any," said Princess Violet, "so how do you know?" "Ah!" said Princess Gamboy, who was 1 minute older than her sister, and she smiled and wouldn't say any more. Meanwhile, the party of horsemen, with the prince at its head, had reached the gate. Violet watched from behind a bush where she could not be seen. She saw the prince send forward a herald, who struck thrice on the bell with his riding crop, for although the prince was in chain mail, none of the party carried swords. Then the prince himself moved his horse forward a few paces and told it to stand still. But the horse, instead of standing still, kept moving its feet about in a mincing little dance, as horses do. So without waiting, the prince stood up in his stirrups, and taking a shining silver trumpet from his baldric— "Oh, there it is silver," thought Violet, and she nearly went and told Gamboy, but she was too interested. Taking a shining silver trumpet from his baldric, he placed it to his lips and calmly blew— "Rooty tooty 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 too, too tooty 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 too, rooty too, rooty too, rooty too too too." Now, at the very first note of the trumpet, the prince's horse, which had been crisscrossing its feet all this time and shaking its head and behaving dainty, suddenly stiffened, pricked up both its ears, and stood as stock-still as a marble horse. And at the very first note of the trumpet, Princess Violet forgot the prince and the garden, and Princess Gamboy, and Mountainy Castle, and the sky above her, and dreamed that she was afloat beneath tons and tons of clear green water near the bottom of the sea, and oh, yes, far away someone was booming a huge bell. She couldn't hear it, but she could tell because all that great water shook. And at the very first note of the trumpet, Princess Gamboy lost her place in the book, where she was reading how for form ze ate Tootston, and instead of being angry and shutting it with a bang, as she usually did when she lost the place, she leaned back in her garden chair and began to think of the time when she was a little baby, before she was called Gamboy, and before Violet and she grew so different from one another, and she even wondered for a moment whether she was really so very much wiser than her sister, even though she was a whole minute older. And at the very first note of the trumpet, all the porters and doorkeepers and sweepers and cooks and bakers and pastry-makers in Mountainy Castle stopped carrying and doorkeeping and sweeping and cooking and baking and pastry-making and looked at each other and listened. And the head porter didn't tell the under porters to get on with their work, and the head doorkeeper didn't tell the under doorkeeper to get on with his work, and the head sweeper and the cook and the baker and the pastry maker didn't tell the under sweepers, cooks, bakers, and pastry makers to get on with their work, but they all stood still, staring and listening like so many loons. Rooty tooty 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 too, too tooty 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 too, rooty too, rooty too, rooty too. As the last note died slowly away, everybody in the castle stirred slowly, like a man waking from sleep, and looked mazily around him. All were full of wonder, and many opened their mouths to ask their neighbors what had happened. But, just as they were about to speak, they seemed to change their minds. They turned their eyes away from each other and down to the ground, as though they were ashamed of something, as though they all knew something they were all pretending they didn't know, and went on with their work. Only the head doorkeeper spoke. He told the under doorkeeper to go and open the gate. And as the last note died slowly away, Princess Gamboy stirred and shook herself and opened her book again. "Don't be a fool, Gamboy," she said to herself, for she had a way of talking to herself. "You are a nice, sensible girl. V is a great silly. Ugh!" And as the last note died slowly away, it seemed to Princess Violet that she was rising slowly through the silent green waters, which still shook all through to the booming of that unseen bell, until at last her head burst up into the open air, and lo and behold, there was no water at all, and she was back in the castle gardens looking at the silver prince who had just taken the trumpet from his lips. Part 1, Chapter 2. The gate was unbarred, and the prince dismounted gravely from his horse and gave it to the herald to hold. "Is His Majesty at home?" he inquired of the under doorkeeper. "His Majesty is at home, sire, but he is about to go a-hunting, and loves not to be delayed." "Well, never mind," said the prince boldly. "I demand an audience." "By what right?" said the fellow sullenly. "By my own right," sternly answered the prince. "By the right of courtesy." And he handed the under doorkeeper a polished mahogany tablet with Prince Courtesy engraved on it. "Take this to your master," he said, and turned away. The under doorkeeper louted low and went into the castle. In a few moments the head doorkeeper appeared and said with a low reverence, "His Majesty awaits you, sire, in the guest chamber." Prince Courtesy followed the head doorkeeper into the castle, across the courtyard, and up a flight of fine stone steps to the guest chamber, where the king was waiting. "Your Majesty," said the prince, "is doubtless aware that I am heir to the throne of the neighboring kingdom of Dravidia. The king my father has sent me abroad to seek adventures, and to choose a maiden to be my queen." "Well," said the king, "it all depends what you mean by adventures. We have no dragons at Mountain Castle, nor riddles to be solved, nor ogres to be slain, and the nearest thing we have to a witch is old Miss Thompson, who, though she is not of the blood royal, is a kindly old body and would not willingly harm a mouse. Besides, she doesn't live in the castle. As to the second part of your request, I have 2 daughters. Need I say more? Have I your consent then, sire, to the hand of one of them?" "You may have the hand of either of them, provided that you first win her heart, but that," said the king, rising from his chair, "is your job and not mine." And he went off hunting. Prince Courtesy was rather dumbfounded at being left alone in a strange castle. He did not know where to go, so he decided to stay where he was, until something happened. And sitting down patiently on a chair, he began to ponder deeply how he could best follow his father's instructions. "Hello, you!" said a voice. Prince Courtesy looked up, astonished, but saw no one. "Hello, you!" said the voice again. "Who are you?" This time the prince saw who had spoken. Deep in the very biggest and reddest armchair in the room was sitting a stout little dwarf, all dressed in red, so that you could hardly see him. "I have been watching you. I have been watching you think. I have been watching you think for 10 minutes, said the dwarf. "Does it hurt? And who are you?" "I am Prince Courtesy," answered the prince politely. "And may I perhaps inquire your name?" "Ah, me!" said the dwarf, and he climbed down off the chair, planted his minikin legs apart, and stuck out both his arms in one long, tremendous yawn. "I am the fat little podger." "I see," said the prince, who was very much surprised indeed. "And will it be inquisitive to ask what you do?" "Not in the least," answered the little fat podger. "I am curator of the royal dump." "What, you are?" said the prince. "I cure the king's megrims, you know." "Oh," said Courtesy. "Wit, you know, wit," said the dwarf. "Jokes, practical jokes, chestnuts, japes, jests, jibes, pranks, cheek, balderdash, noodledum, nincompoopery, somersaults, tumbling, twinkling, capers, and the sidestep step, and the sidestep step, and the sidestep, sidestep, sidestep step." And he said the last words. As he said the last words, he danced solemnly up and down the room, keeping time to them, and flopping his arms and legs about all loosely. He looked so absurd that the prince leaned back in his chair and shouted with laughter. But the little fat podger himself never even smiled. He stopped at last, quite out of breath, and looked across at the prince. "The grotesque, you know, anything Gothic," he said gently. Now the prince was so polite that, as soon as he saw that the dwarf wasn't joining in the laughter, he stopped, although it very much hurt his sides. And then the dwarf came up to him and shook hands with him as though they had only just met. "Can I be of any use to you?" he said. "Advice! Advice good and better, criticism of life, information about the castle, introduction to the daughters of the house, etc., etc." It was very curious. The dwarf spoke so fast, and used such funny long words, that the prince understood a good deal less than half of what he said, and yet he somehow felt in his bones that this queer little creature was good, and meant kindly by him. He felt it in his bones. "Advice," he said thoughtfully. "Yes, tell me where to find adventures. My father sent me out to seek adventures and choose a queen, and I do feel the adventures ought to come first." The dwarf suddenly stood very still with his head perked on one side like a startled sparrow. "Did I understand you to say you were looking for adventures?" "Yes." "Looking for them?" he said slowly. "Yes, looking for them," said the prince. "Looking for them?" said the dwarf again, waggling his head. The prince began to get rather angry with this rude little man. "You offered me your advice," he said. "I asked you a question, and all you do is to pretend you're deaf. It is unkind." The little fat podger bowed. "Apologies," he said. "Amends, repentance, genuflection, the amende honorable, anything refined, but looking for them, poor fellow, poor fellow." He came close up to the prince, whisked on to the arm of his chair, and standing on tiptoe, whispered in his ear, "Take my advice, and don't make yourself absolutely hot over it." "Very well, then. Can you take me to the princesses?" said Courtesy. "Follow me," said the little fat Podger, "to the west corner of the Queen's garden." And off they went. From that moment began one of the strangest stories that could possibly be imagined. The prince stayed on at Mountainy Castle, and of course he and Princess Violet grew quickly fonder of one another. It was only at first that he got actually used to mistake Violet for Gamboy and Gamboy for Violet. That was only at first, because very soon he knew quite well which was which, without having to send a page for the Lord High Teller. Nobody else could ever be quite sure, but Prince Courtesy became as fond of Violet that he knew. But although, whenever he saw Gamboy, he knew she was Gamboy, that didn't make any difference to the fact that he saw very much too much of her. It was the one thing about which he and Violet could not agree. For while Violet still loved her sister more than anything else in the world, more even than Prince Courtesy himself, the prince, well, he just didn't love her at all. She was so hopelessly in the way. It would take much too long to tell how she never left them alone, how, when Violet was dancing to the prince in the west corner of the Queen's garden, she would make sarcastic remarks in a loud voice about people who wasted their time jumping about like toads. How, when the prince thanked Violet for dancing so beautifully and made pretty speeches about her little feet, Gamboy would get up from her chair, slam her book, and say, "Little feet indeed! Tut!" How, in fact, she always managed somehow to spoil their happiness together. But one fine day the prince, who had brought some musicians along with him in his train, ordered them after supper to come out into the west garden of the Queen's garden. First of all out came a man carrying a little fiddle. Then came another man with another little fiddle. Then came another man with a fiddle a little bigger than these. Then another man with a fiddle nearly as big as himself. But lastly a fifth man came with a fiddle so simply enormous that he could hardly carry it. And the men were all dressed in pink, with white frills round their wrists and necks, and yellow stockings, and curly grey wigs on their heads. They sat down and scraped their fiddles once or twice with their fiddling sticks. Meanwhile, Gamboy was grumbling surlily about not being left to read in peace because of the deafening noise they were making. Prince Courtesy would have liked to say, "Well, go away then!" but he knew Violet wouldn't like it, so he kept silence. But at last the musicians stopped scraping. There they all sat still, in the yellow sunlight, with the dark yew hedge behind them. Then the first man began to play a little tune on his little fiddle, and before he had got very far, the second man began to play the same tune on his little fiddle. But the first man didn't stop playing his little tune. Oh, no, he went straight on. And then the third man began to play the same tune on his fiddle, and the fourth man on his, and lastly the fifth man began that very same tune on his great big fiddle, so low down that it sounded like growling thunder. Now Violet and Gamboy had never heard anything like this before, and, as the music played on, they dreamed that the sounds coming from the 5 fiddles were 5 shining silk threads, each of a different color, twisting and twining and curling and winding in and out and over and under one another in a marvelous pattern, and always moving on and on and on, till Violet thought, "It's better than dancing," and Gamboy thought, well, as a matter of fact, she thought of nothing at all. But the curious thing was that when the music stopped, Princess Gamboy sat on in silence, with her hands folded across her lap, staring away into nothing. And all the rest of that evening she never spoke one harsh word. Later on the 3 of them wandered round the Queen's garden, just as the sun was setting and a great golden moon rising out of the mist opposite. And the prince put his arm through Violet's, and Violet put her arm through Gamboy's, and they were all 3 of them so quiet and happy that they never forgot that evening all the rest of their lives. Sometimes, when they were very miserable and hot and tired, the memory of it would suddenly come back to them like a cool breeze blowing on their foreheads, and make them happy again. The next morning the prince, who had grown very friendly with the little fat Podger, told him about this and asked him what he thought it might mean. "Music hath charms," said the dwarf. "Harmony, you know, harmony. Form versus chaos, light versus darkness, and the dominant seventh? It's all one! The prince thought this was rather foolish. It was advice he wanted, and he now asked the dwarf point blank how he might keep Gamboy forever in her gentle mood. Prince, said the dwarf, planting his legs very wide apart, you are a niddikin. And he opened his legs wider and wider, for he had very few bones, and slid down till they stuck out flat on the floor each side of him. Then he jumped up and slapped both his thighs one after the other very quickly, saying, 1, 2. What about the silver trumpet? He shouted, and he slapped both the prince's knees, 1, 2, so that the poor prince howled with surprise. But before he recovered himself, the little fat podger was gone. What does he mean? Thought Courtesy. Then he remembered the silver trumpet hanging from his baldric, the one he had blown so boldly at the castle gate. That afternoon Gamboy was at her old tricks again, but just as she was beginning to say something nasty and sneery about princes, Prince Courtesy took the silver trumpet from his baldric and blew. Your princes, Gamboy was saying, speaking half through her nose, are... Prince Courtesy reached out his hand towards the trumpet. Very fine gentlemen, no doubt. Prince Courtesy's fingers closed on the handle. But whether that's a... The trumpet was at Prince Courtesy's lips. Compliment? Tooty 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 too. Princess Gamboy gulped back the rest of the words and turned her nose down. Tooty 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 too. Princess Gamboy's mouth shut with a snap. Rooty too, rooty too, rooty too. Princess Gamboy folded her hands in her lap and leaned back in the chair, staring far and far away into nothingness. She was dreaming, and oh, she was silent. After that, Violet and the prince were much happier, for the prince had only to blow his trumpet to bring them peace and quiet that they loved. Nevertheless, their troubles were by no means at an end, nor was Gamboy subdued. Part 1, Chapter 3. When they reached the Queen's garden, the dwarf pointed to a tall, dark yew hedge, which looked very quiet and sleepy in the sunlight. You see that hedge? He cried. Yes, said the prince. Well, said the dwarf, the ladies are walking behind there. Goodbye! And he suddenly gave a hop and a skip and a hop and a jump away from the prince, murmuring busily to himself as he did so. 1, 2, 3, and on to it! Hey! Shouted the prince. At this, the little fat podger, poised on one leg, looked back over his shoulder and sang a song. Princesses, princesses, identical dresses, and faces as like as peas. And he would have been off again had not the prince cried out appealingly that he might at least have told them the ladies' names. At that he twirled right round on his toe, and after a pause gave a leap back in the prince's direction, saying as he landed on both feet, Take Violetta! Then he stood quite still and nodded twice very wisely, saying as he nodded, Much better, much better! Then he took another leap towards the prince, balanced on one foot, and shouted out quite loud, If you can get her! Then he took another leap, landed right beside the prince, stretched up on tiptoe, beckoned to him to bend his head down, and seizing the prince's hair in both hands, put his lips to his ear and whispered sharply, Without Gambetta! At which the little fat podger let go the prince's head and danced oddly away, murmuring to himself, to the side, point, 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 to the side, point, 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 and so vanished into the castle. The poor prince was very much bewildered by all this, and he did feel shy as he tiptoed across the wide green lawn which lay between him and the hedge. But when he went round the hedge, he found to his surprise that there was only one princess there. She was sitting reading. This must be Violetta, he thought, for she looked very beautiful. So he went up to her, and kneeling on one knee, said humbly, Most gracious lady, pardon the intrusion of one who is as yet a stranger to you. If I am something too forward in my address, you must believe that it is your beauty which has stolen my manners. But Princess Gamboy, for it was she, looked up from her book and said, Stuff! Well, the poor prince was so taken aback that he hadn't a word to say. He didn't know whether to get up or stay on his knees. At last, as he was not very clever, he said the same thing over again. "Most gracious lady, pardon the intrusion of one who is as yet a stranger to you. If I am something too forward in my address, you must believe that it is your beauty which has stolen my manners." Princess Gamboy went on reading. Which has stolen my manners," repeated the prince nervously. "Will you not vouchsafe—" Princess Gamboy looked up and interrupted him. "If my beauty has stolen your manners, young man, I should have thought the less said about it the better." And she got up, slammed her book, tucked it under her arm, and walked off. In a little while Princess Violet came round the hedge to look for her sister, but the prince, who thought it was Princess Gamboy come back again, pretended not to see her. She recognized him at once as the Silver Prince, who had ridden up to the gate on horseback. So she sat down on Gamboy's chair and waited for him to speak. But, as he continued to stand still with his face turned away from her, at last she rose and went to him, saying kindly, "Most gracious Prince, I fear you are weary after your long journey. Will you not come into the castle, and there rest yourself after you have eaten and drunk your fill?" "Ah, lady," said Prince Courtesy sorrowfully, "that is kind of you, but how can I tell that even as you have just now changed from ungentle to kind, you will not change back again from kind to ungentle? Nay, I had rather be left alone." And he shook his head sorrowfully. How politely they both talked to one another, using much longer words than they did at any other time, and wasn't it funny? "I do not understand you, Prince," said Violet. "I change? How changed, when until now you have never seen me?" "Well, 5 minutes ago," began the prince, "I was with my mother in the castle," she said. But then the prince suddenly remembered how the dwarf had sung, "Princesses, princesses, identical dresses, and faces as like as peas." Yes, faces, he thought to himself, faces as like as peas. Oh, faces to be sure, but most certainly nothing else. "Well, I'm sorry," he said humbly. I thought you were Princess Gamboy." And he knelt and kissed Princess Violet's hand, and rose and went with her into the castle. As soon as the drowsy dream brought upon her by the silver trumpet began to fade, she would open her mouth and start carping and sneering more than ever, so that the prince would have to put the trumpet to his lips and blow again. And it was tiresome to be continually making this odd noise all over the castle grounds. Moreover, if by any chance he left the trumpet behind in his room one day, or if the mouthpiece was clogged up so that it wouldn't blow, they were at the mercy of Gamboy's horrid tongue. At such times she seemed to be bitterer than ever, not because she had anything to complain of, but as though she were making up for all the time she had lost beneath the spell of the silver trumpet. Thus, although Violet and the prince could be sure of any number of peaceful half-hours together, yet in a way matters grew worse and worse, for Gamboy had become so sharp and ill-natured that she and the prince frequently quarrelled openly. After these quarrels, the prince would always feel very worried and miserable. "She is Violet's beloved sister," he would say to himself, thinking sadly of the loud, unkind voice in which he had reproved her, and the many things he wished he had not said, because they had hurt poor Violet's tender heart. At last the prince asked Violet if she would marry him and be his queen. She told him to wait until the following day, when she would give him her answer. Now she was certain in her own mind that the answer would be yes, but all the same she wanted to tell somebody and pretend to ask their advice. So she set out to look for Gamboy, who had been left indoors. But on the way she met the dwarf, and he was such a very great friend of hers that she decided to tell him. "Hooray!" shouted the fat little Podger. "The answer is in the affirmative." And he seized hold of Princess Violet's knees, for he couldn't reach any higher, and insisted on teaching her there and then a new dance, shrieking excitedly, "To the right step, step, to the left step, step, behind, to the side, in front, hop!" They danced up and down together. "Now I am going to tell Gamboy," said Violet breathlessly. "What's that?" said the dwarf, stopping short. "I am going to tell Gamboy," said Violet. "Don't," said the dwarf. "Shall," said Violet, still laughing. "Don't," said the dwarf. "Shall," said the princess, jumping up and down. Now the little fat Podger hated Gamboy as much as he loved Violet, and it was a source of great sorrow to him that Violet could be so fond of anybody so disagreeable. He longed to separate them. Suddenly he changed his mind. "Yes, do," he said, "and when you have told her, listen carefully to what she says." That dwarf was a wise little fellow. He knew a hawk from a handsaw, and, what is more, he knew Princess Gamboy's heart inside out. So Violet went dancing off into the castle. "Create a sensation of glory, all in the land of Judea," she sang, till she came to where Princess Gamboy was. She was sitting in a high-backed chair, casting up the accounts of the Amalgamated Princesses Society. "Gamboy, dear," she began shyly. "Gamboy, darling, I say, better!" And she went on and told her everything. But when she had finished, Princess Gamboy behaved in the most unexpected way, for she got up from her chair, tucked her book under one arm, and with her hands clasped behind her back began to stride up and down the room in silence, frowning angrily. At last she stopped and turned sharply to Violet. "Listen, Violet," she said. "I hate that prince, and if you marry him, I'll have no more to do with you." "Oh, but Betta," said Violet, opening her eyes wide with astonishment, "why do you hate him?" "Because," answered Gamboy, "because, what's that to you, miss? I hate him. Now, which of us are you going to choose?" Violet began to cry. "Oh, Betta, Betta," she said, "why won't you understand? He loves me, and I love him." "Understand!" snapped Gamboy. "Stuff! Don't you imagine that love butters any parsnips? He said he loved you. Oh, yes, he said he loved you. Of course he did. They all say that. Do you know what he really loves? Himself. You admire him so much that when he looks into your silly great eyes, he thinks himself the finest fellow that ever was. That's what he loves. They may say what they like of little Gamboy, but she's no fool. Oh no, my dears, she's no fool." Princess Gamboy was so much pleased with her little speech that she began to strut triumphantly up and down the room, repeating the last words to herself under her breath. But inside Princess Violet's head something seemed to snap suddenly, as though an elastic band had been broken there. It was a spell cast on her by old Miss Thompson at the christening, for there was one thing in the world strong enough to break it, and that was her love for Prince Courtesy. But she did not know this, for she had never heard of the spell. She only knew that something very strange had happened to her, and from moment on she loved Prince Courtesy more than she loved anything else in the world. But she still loved Princess Gamboy next best. She stopped crying, and without saying a word looked straight into her sister's eyes. Gamboy stopped still, and the two princesses stood for a whole minute, looking at each other in silence. But then Princess Gamboy's eyes fell to the ground abashed, and Princess Violet turned and left the room. She found the prince waiting in the garden. "Courtesy!" she cried. "You needn't wait till tomorrow. The answer is yes." If you knew all that is still to happen, you would say it had scarcely begun. Therefore, you must try and imagine to yourself what took place in the next few months, how happy the prince and Violet were together, in spite of Gamboy's ill nature, how for a long time she refused to speak to either of them, and how unhappy this made Violet, though the prince didn't care a rap. But although she wouldn't speak to them, neither would she leave them alone. You see, it would have been very little pleasure to her to sulk alone in her room and from her window see them walking and whispering together down in the garden. So she contrived to be always waiting round the corner, and as soon as they came near she would get up from her chair, pull her skirts about her, and march away with her head in the air without looking at them. Or if they came into a room in the castle, she was sure to be sitting there already, and she would get up and go out, slamming the door after her. This always made poor Violet feel unhappy for quite a long time, and even the prince would feel uncomfortable, which was just what Princess Gamboy wanted. You may be surprised that she should still have wanted Violet to feel unhappy when she loved her better than anything else in the world. But there are two ways of loving people. One is to like to see them well and happy, which was Violet's way of loving, and the others to like to do what you tell them to do, which was Gamboy's way. One day, Princess Violet stopped Princess Gamboy and asked her why she was so angry with her, and Gamboy raised her eyebrows and answered coldly, "My dear child, I am not in the least angry with you. Why should I be angry? I am only concerned for your happiness. I am sure I hope you will always be as happy as you are now." And she swept out of the room and left Violet crying. But the prince frowned and said, "Stuff!" which was quite right, because it was all lies from beginning to end, and he knew it. And you must also imagine to yourself how the preparations went forward for the wedding, and how the prince began to feel horribly nervous, lest, in the excitement of the moment, he should find himself married to Gamboy instead of Violet. How dreadful that would have been! But remember that the two princesses, in accordance with the law, were dressed exactly alike, and both wore their hair hanging loosely down their backs and were well keemed. It might happen, you know. So at last, in his perplexity, the prince went for advice to the little fat podger, and when he had told him his trouble, the little fat podger stood thinking for a while, and then skipped away with 3 great grasshoppery jiggery jumps, looking back over his shoulder and crying out at each step, "Twiddle-em, twaddle-em, 21!" How puzzled the poor prince was, till suddenly he remembered having been told that the law about the princesses only held good till their 21st birthday, and then he understood what the dwarf meant. So he delayed the preparations for the wedding, in spite of his impatience, and arranged that they should be married on Violet's 21st birthday, when she would be able to wear what she pleased. At last, the longed-for morning came, and at breakfast time everybody waited to see what kind of clothes the two princesses would wear. Of course they had both looked forward very much to the day when they would be able to wear what they pleased, and each of them, without saying a word to the other, had been secretly preparing her new dress for a month past. Yes, even Gamboy was pleased and excited about this, for, as she said, it was not the clothes themselves that mattered, but the liberty to choose them for yourself, by which she meant the liberty to make yourself look as ugly as you pleased. Gamboy came down first, and everybody gasped to see how different she looked from yesterday. She had put on a narrow, straight, skimpy black dress, which was no wider at the bottom than it was at the top, so that she looked like an umbrella stand. As for her hair, she had just taken hold of it with both hands, pulled it back as far as it would go over the top of her head, and tied it there with 3 pieces of string. But she had tied it so tightly that her eyes looked as though they were starting from her head with surprise. She did look funny, and when they saw Gamboy's hair, all the ladies in waiting at the breakfast table put down their knives and forks and let their bacon get cold, while they giggled and tittered to each other. "She's done it in a bun! She's done it in a bun!" "What's that?" said Gamboy sharply. And everybody dropped their eyes and picked up their knives and forks and went on eating in silence. But then the door opened, and Princess Violet came in. She was dressed in white from head to foot, and her skirt fell spreading from her waist so lightly that she seemed to float on air. And her beautiful long hair was piled and piled on top of her head up against a marvelous comb made of old silver, which rose above it at the back like a tower on the top of a rocky hill, or like St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall. And once again everybody put down their knives and forks and stared. They stared at her in amazement, for yesterday she had been a pretty little girl, and now it seemed she was a beautiful lady. How glad Prince Courtesy was that he had waited till her 21st birthday! And even the king, who had come downstairs in a bad temper because he was to go to the wedding that day instead of going hunting, even the king smiled with delight, and rose and kissed his daughter, and was most sweet-tempered all the rest of the day. No fear of mistaking them now, thought Courtesy to himself, and indeed it would be hard to imagine 2 more different people. Their very faces no longer looked the same, though of course they were exactly the same really, and if Princess Gamboy had cared, she would have made herself look as beautiful as her sister. When Violet and Gamboy had opened all their parcels, for people receive more presents on their 21st birthday than on any other, There was a tremendous bustle throughout the castle, and everybody, from the Lord High Teller of the other from which, who no longer had any work to do, but still went on drawing a high salary for it from the king's treasury, to the smallest and dirtiest of the stable boys, began to scrub himself up and put on his best clothes in readiness to start for the church. At 11 o'clock every soul in the castle started off in a long winding procession, some in chariots, some on horseback, some in sedan chairs, and some afoot, to go to the church, which lay a mile off. The wedding, too, you must imagine for yourself, and how Princess Gamboy, in her skimpy black dress, sat in the front row and glowered at the bride and bridegroom all the while it was going on. She would have frowned as well, only she had tied her hair back so tightly that she couldn't move her forehead. But as the party came out of the church, the prince's herald, who had been stationed at the door, put the silver trumpet to his lips and blew, and the sound that came out of the mouth of the trumpet was Rudy tooty 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 too, tooty 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 too, Rudy too, Rudy too, Rudy too. And Gamboy, who was just passing him as he blew, started and smiled in spite of herself, and ran as best she could in her narrow dress to Violet and kissed her on the lips. But then the sound of the trumpet died away out of her ears, and she fell back ashamed of herself, glowering at everybody near her, and walked on in moody silence at the tail of the procession. But when they reached the castle, there was still another surprise in store for them, for the old king came up to the prince, and suddenly fell on his knees before him, offering him the hilt of his sword, and saying, "Homage to the King Courtesy, and Queen Violet!" Then Violet, who could not bear to see her father kneel, put her arms round his neck and raised him up, whereupon he explained that he and the queen had decided that they were too old and too tired to reign any more, and they wished King Courtesy and his wife to govern the realm from now onwards. So Courtesy humbly thanked the old king for his kindness, and vowed he would strive to be worthy of so great an honour. He and Violet took the oath there and then, and, as they mounted the throne, everybody in the castle shouted aloud with one great shout, "Long live King Courtesy and Queen Violet!" till the old stone walls echoed to the sound. And, as they mounted the throne, the silver trumpet rang out again, high above the shouting and the din. Rudy tooty 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 too, too, tooty 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 too, Rudy too, Rudy too, Rudy too. And then died slowly away, while Princess Gamboy walked, as in a dream, to the foot of the throne and bowed her head, doing homage to the king and to her sister the queen. That night lights blazed from every window in the castle, so that far away on the hills the shepherds, gathered around their fires, saw 3 unbroken rows of little twinkling lights like stars, and they took off their caps, crying, "Long live the king and queen!" Nor did they know that it was a new king and queen they were hailing. But inside a castle a great ball was afoot, with Japanese lanterns in the courtyard, and strawberries and peacocks for supper, and the great throne hall blazing with candles. All the while the little fat Podger danced madly in and out of the throng, leaping higher and higher, up, 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 and again. He shrieked and turned 2 somersaults in the air because Violet was happy. Nor was the new queen herself too dignified to dance a little dance of her own in the center of the hall, while everybody looked on, and when she had finished everyone applauded clamorously, not because she was the queen, but because she had danced like a leaf in the wind. Everyone, that is, except Princess Gamboy. She sat alone and aloof at a corner of the supper table, eating, 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 and drinking, drinking, drinking. She had not even changed her clothes, and all the time she grew more and more jealous of the prince and spiteful towards everybody, for this was not the kind of music that made her dream. A year slipped by. The young king and queen lived all that time in almost perfect happiness, for there was nothing now to mar their joy except Gamboy's tantrums, and though these were growing more frequent and more violent, yet they gave less trouble than before because, now Courtesy was king, he took the law into his own hands and refused to let her come into the presence unless she could behave herself.
Violet agreed to this with great reluctance. She saw that it was necessary, but the coolness between herself and Gamboy was an increasing load of sorrow upon her heart, a load which she could still feel in the midst of all her happiness, and one of which she longed to rid herself. But what of the silver trumpet? Would not that serve to soften her sister's heart, and to bring them together again, at least for an hour? Alas, it was lost! It had never been seen since the night of the wedding. On that night Queen Violet had asked the king to give it to her to play with. He had refused at first, for when he left home his father had bidden him never, never to part with it, no, not even to save his life. But when he told Violet this, she only laughed and pouted a little, saying, "Oh, pooh, sir, you have small faith in our happiness if you think it hangs on such a toy. Keep your old trumpet." She was merry with jest and dancing and meant small harm, yet Courtesy, who had never heard her speak so before, was troubled inwardly and felt his heart ache for a moment as though he were alone. So, to ease his little pain, he gave it to her with a forced smile, saying, "Guard it well, then, and at night see you keep it under lock and key." Whereupon she took it and tossed it up like a ball for joy, but that very night left it lying on a couch in the throne hall. And when she woke in the middle of the night and remembered what she had done, she was sorry, but she would not trouble to go and put it away. For it seemed to her then that nothing could ever make her unhappy again, and that she and the king had no need to be careful of anything. And now nobody knew where it was. Nobody. Yes, one person knew, Princess Gamboy. She had found it in the throne hall early the next morning, and taken and hidden it in an old disused loft above the stables. Princess Gamboy had come to hate and fear the strange power which that trumpet had over her. She was too proud, you see, to surrender to anything except her own self-will, and the thought of the new king everlastingly blowing his own trumpet drove her hopping mad. But there were the 5 musicians with their 5 fiddles. Why could they not be brought in to make life more smooth at the castle? Surely the king had not forgotten that wonderful moonlit evening in the west corner of the Queen's garden. No, he had not forgotten it, but, how sad it is to tell, all was not well in the land over which King Courtesy ruled. Last year's harvest had failed, and his subjects were growing very poor. There would have been a famine in the cold winter, and all the little children would have starved or frozen to death if the king had not sent abroad to the neighboring countries to buy grain and fuel for his subjects. But the rich merchants of the neighboring countries would not yield up their grain and their coal except for money. Consequently, the king's treasury grew emptier, and the musicians had to be dismissed, and the king and queen, although they lived in a great castle, were very, very poor. In the evenings, while King Courtesy was racking his brains for ways and means to relieve the distress, the queen would sit by the fire, and oh, such a small one, mending up his old socks and turning his old clothes inside out to make them look like new. And this was a great hardship to the king, who until that year had always been given a new pair of socks every day. For the hardest of all trials in the world is to have to do without something you've been accustomed to all your life. And just at first I believe it was very nearly as hard for the king to do without his socks as it was for the poor people to do without their fires. But he knew all the same that fires were very much more important than new socks, so he said nothing about it to anyone. Yet even this was not the saddest part of the story. For the people, in spite of all their king's efforts to help them, in spite of his empty treasury and his tired white face, began to growl and complain and even to threaten. They had never had a famine before, they said, and they had never had a King Courtesy before, therefore the one must be because of the other. Moreover, there were many ill-natured people going about the land, who stirred up and increased this hatred as much as they could.